Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Graban, the VP of Customer Success at KaiNexus, and I'm author of the book Lean Hospitals and co-author of the book Healthcare Kaizen.
Hey, and I'm Dr. Greg Jacobson, the co-founder and the chief product officer of KaiNexus.
And we would like to both welcome you to our webinar today titled Getting Started with Continuous Improvement, Lessons and Reflections. We want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. And Greg's going to introduce KaiNexus as a company if you don't know about us.
Yeah, so KaiNexus, we are a technology company. We have a piece of software that really helps organizations engage their frontline staff, helps organize all of their lean or improvement work, and was really born out of my work when I started as a attending physician at Vanderbilt and started to implement Miyazaki Imai's principles in our emergency department, and just saw a lack of kind of a management system, if you will, to get everyone on the same page. And so the idea was born, could we provide that for organizations so they can focus on the improvement work? We know that technology can help change behaviors, and we're seeing that. So hence the creation of KaiNexus and what we do.
Yeah. So, our theme today is, this idea of getting started with continuous improvement. And a lot of people refer to this as a journey. We're on a continuous improvement journey, a lean journey. And I'm just reminded of this great quote from the philosopher Lao Tzu that says basically, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And those of you who saw the slides in advance will realize I'd prepared a slide with the picture and the quote. And here in Austin, Texas, where Greg and I are sitting, I was walking up South Congress to go get a snack. And I walked past, look at the sign that had that exact same quote. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And all of our continuous improvement journeys begin with that single step. And it's important to think back, those of us that are a few dozen steps or 100 steps down this journey, let's think back to our first steps, because at some point we have to get started. We can't just study continuous improvement and think about it and talk about it forever. We have to, at some point, get started. And I think it's important to recognize that getting started can be difficult. And at some point, you have to go. You have to give it a try. We're going to learn by doing. And even 20 years into my own continuous improvement journey, if you will, we're, I think, hopefully all continually improving our approach to how we do things, how we teach things, how we talk about continuous improvement. And I think it's important to step back and reflect. I know this is certainly true for me, that we're likely not really good at this when we start. But again, we shouldn't let that get in the way of giving it a good effort. We can try to learn from others, hopefully have coaches and mentors, and just go and give it a try and go. So what are some of the reasons why people maybe aren't as good at this as they're going to be later? Sometimes it's a lack of knowledge. I think sometimes with lean and continuous improvement, a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. We learn about a tool, we hear a little bit, we think, oh, well, that's easy. And then we have some missteps or some mistakes, and we learn from that. And we realize it's not as easy as we thought it was. I hear organizations all the time in their their second or third year say, we're just now realizing how difficult this process can be. Sometimes it's lack of experience, and I don't know how else we solve lack of experience other than doing things and gaining that experience. And I think one of the other pitfalls we run into is relying a little bit too much on saying, well, what does lean say we should do? What would that hospital system do? What does Toyota tell us? And at some point we have to balance what we've learned from others with thinking through things ourselves. Maybe if we're going to copy anything, copy a process rather than trying to copy the exact methods that people have done. Do we understand our problem? Do we understand what's happening?
I mean, I think the goal of what we're really trying to talk about is kind of set up those first steps that people are going to take in there. And while certainly the one end of the pendulum is, well, we're going to study forever and never do, and the other end of the pendulum is we're just going to start doing and not even think about what we're doing. And obviously, the middle ground is the best way to go. And so what we're going to try to do is kind of set up the idea of, hey, we have 3 people in the room that have done this, and here are some things that we learned that worked and things that didn't work. So your middle ground doesn't have to have any big stumbles in it, or at least if those stumbles happen, which they inevitably will,
right,
they're small and they don't really stop your forward momentum.
Yeah, because I think learning about other people's mistakes, including our own, won't completely help you from making any mistakes on your own. But hopefully, we can be careful and avoid the big major mistakes, right, but not be so scared of making little mistakes, right, as we go. And one thing to keep in mind, and look, this is some of my own personal reflection as well, to think about the idea of being kind to those who are new to this, and trying to be patient, trying to be teachers and coaches, that we maybe shouldn't be too hard on those who are just starting with Lean or with Kaizen or with continuous improvement or with Six Sigma. Trying to think back to our own first year and say, well, mistakes will be made. There are some good mistakes that we can build upon, and they're learning opportunities. There might be some bad mistakes that really derail things at a really big picture or even locally within a team. But I think as people who are more experienced with Lean and still learning and still improving, we should try to keep in mind that whether it's in the workplace and other places, to try to coach and help people improve rather than stepping back and criticizing. And, again, part of my own reflection, I'm hopefully not going to beat myself up too much for this, is, thinking about some of my own blogging and saying, well, if I'm criticizing a practice, I try not to attack the person. It's usually never that someone is stupid or uncaring or foolish, but they don't have as much experience. And sometimes thinking about those scenarios will help us learn. I think I'm more patient if someone is continuing to learn and improve. If they say, look, I'm new to this, I'm trying to get better. What irritates me is when someone says, well, I'm an expert, I've learned this, and now I'm, as if they don't have anything more to learn. But I think of some of my blog posts where I've written about things that I think are silly, companies that get really over enthusiastic about 5S and tell everybody to put tape around every stapler on every desk, and to remove family photos from their desk because those aren't productive. I think that's really silly and a really bad practice. And I've criticized those practices on my blog, as you see here. And I've written a number of posts where I talk about this acronym I call LAME. Lean is misguidedly executed. Now, and I think I'm trying to be kind in the acronym. Someone's being misguided or mistaken. It's not, people are messing up and being idiots. But I think sometimes I need to think and just be careful that, if I'm sharing stories or trying to, kind of give feedback, that I'm trying to do it in a kind way as opposed to some sort of I'm better than you sort of way.
Right. To me, the translation to being a teaching physician at Vanderbilt, and I actually have the opportunity to work with residents now. It's, ironically, sometimes residents have a better mastery of the knowledge because they're studying it like in real time and spending a massive amounts of time acquiring the knowledge. But obviously, what a teaching physicist brings to the table is that whole level of experience, and so whenever I'm trying to do teaching, it's always a kind of frame thing. Say, well, in my experience, this has worked and this hasn't worked, and I didn't start with this innate knowledge. I mean, I just kind of went through life, and you kind of pick up little tidbits, and we like to refer to those as pearls in medicine. So the idea here was, could we put a couple pearls together that we could, bestow on this crowd, that they could take little nuggets that, may not translate perfectly out of a book, that sometimes you need to have actually made those mistakes to learn, so to speak. And maybe, hopefully, help other people make either smaller mistakes or less mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and, Greg's going to chime in about this again in a second. When we talk about, the people's professional progressions as we move along in our careers, as we move along and using different improvement methodologies, there's terminology that people in other fields other than my own use. People talk about practicing law. People talk about practicing medicine. I think it's an interesting phrase. Greg's going to
I was, Mark and I were preparing for this. I love doing these webinars because in our preparation of figuring out, what can we put together that's fresh, that's new, that we haven't really talked about before, that we're learning from our current actions with implementing, there I go again, practicing lean. Mark brought this point up, and I was just absolutely intrigued by this. We do talk about practicing law and practicing medicine. People make jokes about it, because when you practice something, you're gonna, you're learning how to do something.
You'll get good at it someday.
But I was wondering, what were the origins of these expressions? And so, just some quick internet searching. I thought it was really interesting that the first time it actually appeared in spoken or in English was back in 1421 in the OED, where they talk about it being to pursue or be engaged in a particular occupation, professional skill, or art. And then by 1542, it actually became to mean what we mean today, to perform an activity or exercise a skill repeatedly or regularly in order to acquire, improve, or maintain proficiency. And I thought, we need to really stop saying that we're implementing lean. And we need to say that we're practicing lean, because it's this recognition that there really isn't a beginning, there really isn't an end. There is going to be a constant action of engaging your actions via this body of knowledge. It's exactly what people are doing in law, exactly what people are doing in medicine, or what people are doing in architecture and all the other things. And so I'm really glad we brought this up. And I know you're going to kind of mention a couple other points on kind of this shift from kind of this mentality of implementing to this mentality of practicing.
Yeah, and I think we can think about that in terms of our organizations. We are implementing lean, or what really makes me cringe is when people say, "Oh yeah, we implemented that 2 years ago." It kind of shows, I think, that beginner's misunderstanding of what lean is about, that it's not just a project. I think, Greg, when you're talking about acquiring, improving and maintaining proficiency, the same thing would apply to individuals who have a certification. And occasionally you hear someone kind of talk about that as an end. Right. I got certified. I'm an expert now. I know everything about this. And I think it's a healthier view to look at that certification as a beginning. Sort of like, Greg, your medical degree is hopefully just the beginning of your ongoing improvement.
Right. And I think what's important here is to say that, just because it's your beginning doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to do it well. And also doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to have real impact. I mean, I truly believe that a first-year medical student is bringing some value to the whole patient experience, just like a first-year resident. Now, obviously, a 20-year attending is going to have a lot more knowledge and experience. They may also be bringing a lot more baggage as well to the table. So just because you're at the beginning doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to see just kind of immediate results of the practice of lean.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So I think about kind of a progression that I've reflected upon, saying over time in your progression as a continuous improvement professional, I think at first you learn how to do. I think back, the first year, early stages of my career, you learn how to use a particular tool or how to use a particular method. And you can have some benefit to that. You can help people improve ergonomics, improve safety, prevent errors. But then at some point, I think there's a natural progression where you start to learn how to teach. And this is where I think we can engage people in the workplace. We're not doing it, quote unquote, doing it to them, but we're doing it with them. We're teaching people how to use these methods themselves. And now we're teaching and we're coaching as opposed to doing it. And I think as we get maybe even further along, we learn how to teach how to teach. So I think in terms of maybe, to use a green belt example, green belt level might be learning to do. Black belts are learning how to teach because they're teaching green belts. And then a master black belt is teaching black belts how to teach so that they can eventually become a master black belt themselves. That's a very natural progression. So with that, I'm going to turn things to Greg to talk about some of his first year in continuous improvement.
So, whenever we talk about trying to instill a pearl, it's always best to try to narrow your focus into one aspect. So I've decided to kind of break this up into, one thing I think I could have done a lot better in my first year, and one thing I think I nailed in my first year. Now there's probably 100 things I could have done better, and hopefully a couple dozen things I did really well. But I really want you guys to take just one of each one of these. So one of the biggest things I felt I did was I didn't do very well. I'm going to kind of give this story now to articulate it. So we're going back to 2004, 2005. I had read Miyazaki Imai's book, Kaizen. I had been given the book by the leader of my emergency medicine department, the chairman, who said, I want you to go and teach residents how to do this and implement a Kaizen program. And I was all gung-ho. I thought, well, this is actually brilliant. And so, what did I do? I went right to the frontline staff because, Kaizen is about engaging the frontline staff. And I went ahead and taught them. And one of the things I think, just a little side note, I learned that you don't really need to teach, years worth of knowledge to frontline staff to help them start engaging in the improvement process. And so they immediately got the concepts and started engaging in identifying, opportunities for improvement.
Let me ask you a question. When you were given the challenge of go and teach this to the others, did you go through a learn how to do phase, or was that kind of simultaneous of doing and teaching?
I did go through a learn how to do, but that wasn't in my first year. It was really over about a 3-year period. I initially gave almost a 3-hour lecture series to frontline staff, to the residents, and over those 3-year period, it actually got compressed down to almost a 15-minute primer. And I was able to learn that the identification of really good opportunities for improvement you could give people enough knowledge in about 15 minutes. Yeah. Doesn't mean they're going to be able to problem solve, but they're going to be able to identify the type of stuff that we're looking for.
And I think that's a really good lesson learned. And I've heard that from others, and I think I've gotten better about this, to give people training at the right time, the right amount of training, the right training at the right time when people can go and apply it.
Right. The biggest problem I did is I completely left out everyone in between. I went right from, in this group of 300 people, right from the CEO and went right down to the frontline staff, leaving out, the middle managers and senior leaders of this organization. And it ultimately created a scenario where the middle leadership of this group had no idea what their expectations were. They didn't really realize what was going on. And I didn't tell them, hey, the leader of this organization strategically wants us to start doing this type of behavior. It fits with our mission. This is the expected, system that we're putting in place. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that, Mark? How does this seem like something that you want to get behind? What are your concerns? And I think a simple 5 to 10 minute conversation with the 5 or 10, we're not talking about hundreds of people. It would have been 5 or 10 key people that could have had a 5 or 10 minute conversation to say, this is what's about to happen, and prep them. Would have just been a huge benefit to my first year.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a really common, maybe even organizational mistake of people relying too much on somebody who is a process improvement specialist,
right,
to go in and try to help drive change, instead of having the direct departmental managers or directors really owning and embracing, not just throwing a solution at them or implementing it for them, but making sure that they understand the problem that's being addressed.
So to me, this was really a change management issue. Mm-hmm. I really failed in that first year in executing change management. And change management certainly needs to come from the leadership, but that leadership needs to, and in this case, it was me. I was kind of leading this effort, needs to articulate what's the value of doing this, why this aligns with the strategic initiatives, and this is kind of the expectation, and start that dialogue. So let's flip, and now I'm going to talk about something that I think I did really well. And in part, as with everything, it's better to be lucky than to be good. Mm-hmm. And I think I was lucky because I really learned about all these from Mr. Imai, who really focuses on low cost, low risk type of changes. And when you're looking and you're teaching people about non-value added steps, and no problem is too small to focus on, that staff can be easily trained. We talked about this a bit. And one of the other things that Mr. Imai talks really well about is making sure that you're telling people specifically what you're looking for, letting the frontline staff know we're looking for opportunities for improvement, and those look like this. They're not going to be things where we need to spend a lot of money. They're not going to be things where we need to implement a ton of technology or build a new wing. Okay, those things may need to happen. There's no question. But what we want frontline staff to focus on are the low cost, low risk changes that make their work frustrating, and that either is causing them to do bad patient care, or whatever their work has to do.
Yeah, you're not telling them what the answers are, but you're telling the types of things to go and look for. Not to go find $1 million idea,
right?
But to find little annoyances, irritations, patient complaints. Let's fix those things.
And by doing that, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for success. Because when they find low cost, low risk improvements, you're actually able to implement those improvements. And there's that positive reinforcement. I'm reading a book called Habits right now. And it's just a perfect example of why you can build a habit in an organization by giving the immediate reward of, hey, we identified a problem and now it's fixed, and the person can immediately see it and go, oh, this is brilliant. I don't have to worry about this anymore. And so a little bit of guidance, and then really it's just about taking baby steps and developing habits. So those, I think, pearl number one, change management. Talk to all the leadership in an organization. To everybody. And make it one-on-one, just 5-10 minutes. We're not talking about several hours. And then pearl number two, really make it about small, tiny changes. What's really interesting as a footnote here, Mark, and you and I have been really fascinated by this, is that, and we don't have an exact percentage now, but somewhere around 1 in 50 to 1 in 100 small opportunities for improvement end up having huge impact.
Right.
And I think that is just fascinating.
Yeah, there's that idea of the best way to find a big idea is to have lots of little ideas, identifying lots of little problems, implementing lots of little solutions, and then you'll inevitably stumble across something that's big.
Yeah, and inevitably,
but easily done.
Right,
big impact. Sorry,
but easily done.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the key. Also,
right.
Yeah. And we're developing a really large data set to figure out exactly what that percentage is, but it looks like it's in that range where impact might be $50,000, $100,000, even $500,000 when there was never the thought to go after that initially.
Yeah, cool. All right, so I'm going to talk about. I've had 2 different first years in continuous improvement. One was my very first year, right out of college, as an industrial engineer at the GM Livonia engine plant, which is in my hometown of Livonia, Michigan. And I got all of the kind of woe is me horror stories out of my system when Greg and I were rehearsing and practicing this earlier in the week. It was a challenging environment in a lot of ways to go in, to be a young, eager, idealistic, well-meaning person who's trying to help make improvements. There were a lot of really challenging things in that environment. But I think some of my lessons learned, rather than just stepping back and blaming the organization and the culture, thinking about, well, what did I do? What could I have done better and differently? I think when I was, in that engineer mindset of it's my job to go and do stuff, to put in new equipment that would help improve safety, to go take that as a project. A lot of that, I think, was very me driven instead of team driven. I think a lot of this work, I was doing this to try to help the frontline employees, to drive benefits to the people and to the organization. But I was still in that mindset of, well, I've got to do this. I've got to do the analysis. I've got to do the research about which equipment. I need to make those decisions. And I probably just didn't get enough input from people in the organization. And I think again, a lot of that was just the nature of that environment. It wasn't really encouraged, unfortunately, to go and get input from the team members who worked there.
It's like the difference between, you can go drill a well for someone, or you can go teach someone how to drill a well.
Yeah.
That kind of concept.
Yeah. I think in my first year and at that stage of the organization, we were implementing a lot of tools. We had people there who had been hired from Toyota suppliers and other organizations I learned a lot from, that would talk about management practices and culture. The organization just wasn't to that step yet. We had some really kind of old school leaders, and you try to, follow lean mindsets as you've learned about them the best you can. in an environment. And I think for a lot of people, starting off with tools is a natural first step before we can move on to management practices and philosophy and culture change. I think, one thing was a lesson learned. We didn't track ideas visually. We had a suggestion box. There was an officially endorsed company UAW suggestion program that I even participated in as an engineer. And ideas just went to die in that suggestion box. That's something we've talked about in other webinars. And it really just drove home the point to me that if you're even going to pretend to ask for people's ideas, you need to do something with those ideas. I got discouraged when I felt like my ideas weren't listened to. And that was a great lesson, because I think, well, how would others feel? How do others feel today if we're asking for their ideas and we're not helping them, if we're not listening, if we're not moving on? One thing, and I think maybe other engineers will relate to this, I spent too much time playing around with computer simulation software. Because I was taught how to do this as an industrial engineer, to do really analytical looks at questions like how much inventory should we have? What's the effect of improving uptime on different machines? You can spend a lot of time in this software basically looking for the quote unquote right answer, or going and experimenting, or using a PDSA mindset of plan, do, study, adjust. Set the inventory level to a certain point, and let's try to tweak and adjust that. Let's see what happens when we lower the inventory level. So I think there's some benefit to learning from that, but I probably spent too much time at my computer doing that. And that's something I think I got away from within my first couple of years. But especially early in my first year, I had this tool that I learned in college, and GM had the software, and I thought I had to use it. And I may have overdone that. And I think one of my other lessons learned is that I didn't build good relationships with the very direct frontline supervisors, or what they called team coordinators, which was a well-intended phrase, but they were foremen. They were old school supervisors. And I think I worked well with frontline staff. And maybe my blind spot was sort of writing off like, oh, those people are never going to change. Let me just keep out of their way. And so
what I love about this point, Mark, is this one sounds a lot like the pearl I said.
Yeah.
I wrote them off because I figured they would just get it. These people, of course, would want to improve the emergency department. Why wouldn't they get on board? You wrote them off for the exact opposite reason. But the end conclusion of both of us is to go develop those relationships.
Yeah. And there's going to be bumps in those relationships.
Of course. That means actually meeting these people, I think, in person.
Yeah.
And really kind of, that's a face-to-face kind of getting to know people.
And I think there's another lesson learned that didn't become clear until a few years ago, of thinking of those old school managers and why were they acting that way. And it wasn't because they were bad people, but they were also kind of a product of 30 years in that old school culture. And I had a second plant manager who had experience in the GM Toyota joint venture. And when I reconnected with him a little bit a few years ago and asked about some of these other managers and why were you so patient with some of those other managers and their bad behavior, and he said, you have to understand, they didn't have the benefit that I had of learning a new way, of being coached and mentored by the Toyota people. Like, I get it. I was young, I was impatient, I was judgmental. And maybe along those lines, I try to learn, lessons about not getting too emotional. So I spent a lot of time on the shop floor, in the Gemba, if you will. I saw situations that were unsafe. Situations that had been reported to maintenance and weren't being worked on. They weren't being prioritized, apparently. And, there was a time where I literally saw it looked like somebody could have been hurt really badly by one of these nagging issues. And, this is 1995. We didn't even have computers and email. So the emotion, and I left a really probably kind of nasty, emotional sounding voicemail and copied it to a whole bunch of people and really called out that maintenance manager for not getting this stuff fixed. And someone could have gotten hurt. And, that was not a good relationship building move with that maintenance manager. And, there's being right. And then there's being savvy,
effective
within the organization. I think I was right, but I was not, I know it's tough. I mean, I felt like I needed to make waves and draw attention to the situation. But that can backfire on you.
Right.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the positive lessons like Greg shared. I think what I got really good advice about building relationships. One of the quote unquote old school supervisors had actually, I think, taken a lot of the Deming training to heart and had really, I think, sort of come around into a different mode. And he told me right away, make sure that you're not just doing your work, but that you're also building relationships. And this was helpful to me as an engineer, that there's a balance. You're not going to sit there and chit chat with people all day long, but you have to get to know people and they have to get to know you. And that included the UAW shop committee people. I got the advice of sit down and have a cup of coffee with them and let them know that you're trying to help, that that we can work together on things that are of mutual benefit to the employees, hopefully also to the company. Part of that I think helped create some cover where in some ways I was able to go against the grain of the existing culture where, again, the environment was one that normally just did not engage frontline staff. We had something called the jobs bank where employees were paid to come and sit in the cafeteria instead of being laid off. It was part of the union agreement. And I thought, well, what a waste. And there were actually guidelines in the contract where you could get people from the jobs bank to come help work on improvement projects with you. And most engineers thought, well, why would I want to do that? Mm-hmm. And I went and did that. And I found people that were actually really keen to be involved in improvement work. They didn't want to sit there rotting away in the cafeteria. Some of them were really excited to come out and participate and work together. And I'm glad I had that experience. And even in an environment where a lot of people would just write off those employees because they're also a product of their environment, right? The same way. I think I learned from the plant manager who had the Toyota experience that quality and cost improvement go together. I literally asked him one day when he was talking about our cost problem and our quality problem. And I asked him, I said, well, which do we need to work on first? And he looked at me, and I think he was being patient and a coach instead of being judgmental about what I didn't know. And he explained, well, we have to do both. And by improving quality, we will reduce cost. These go hand in hand. They really can't be separated. And I think that was a great lesson that I've even seen in healthcare. So I think I naturally spent a lot of time at the Gemba when I wasn't doing computer simulations. Email was not a huge time sink at that point, thankfully. But that plant manager was also in the Gemba a lot. So, the leader of 800 employees was out there talking, listening, building relationships, setting a good example. And, he told me one day, he said about that plant, he said, I probably know what a lot of the answers are here and what we need to do in terms of changing the culture, changing the way we manage, trying to change the environment. He said, but they don't know that I know, meaning the employees. They didn't know him from any other manager. Mm-hmm. They didn't know that he had different perspectives from a lean management perspective, that he had to get to know people. And he spent probably more time listening than talking, which I thought set a great example. And then let's just talk briefly about my first year in healthcare. So here's a picture from 2005 in a medical laboratory and a picture of a team that I worked with. Now, I think the picture on the right shows some of my progression. This is about my 10th year in continuous improvement, that you see a team of people from a lab designing their future layout and experimenting with their layout. So instead of me, the engineer, figuring out the layout, I taught them principles and different ideas for them to figure out what that best layout would be.
Now, when I look at that picture, the biggest thing I see is the fact that you have absolutely no gray hair.
They have no gray hair, and that's more a function of age. I'm not going to blame healthcare for the gray hair that the attendees can't see.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
Yeah, I know. But some of my lessons from that first year, and I think a lot of people, when they make this transition from manufacturing to healthcare, sometimes I say, well, I'm an expert. I know about lean, but it's okay to be honest about what you don't know. And I think it really hampers other people. I've heard their reflections about their first year in healthcare. If they sort of come across with having the attitude of, okay, I'm here to fix you, mm-hmm. Organizations and people are really good at resisting that, as opposed to saying, hey, let's share your experiences, my experiences. We'll figure this out together. So along those lines, I was lucky to be able to partner up with a number of different clinicians and to learn back and forth. And I see this work really well in other healthcare organizations. A lean person from industry combined with a nurse who has good continuous improvement instincts. But at the same time, I think I relied when I was doing training or explaining things, I relied too much on talking about manufacturing history, which was interesting to me. People in healthcare really didn't care about that at all.
Right.
So that's one way of getting 3-hour training down to 10 minutes.
Yes.
You eliminate some of the trivia or the history, and all I had was factory examples, and I think factory examples have a time and a place, but you have to use them well, and you have to make sure you explain the context.
And I think now with the fact that healthcare has been focusing on process improvement so much relative to where they were back in 2005, there are examples. I mean,
yes.
Part of it, there just wasn't that many examples in healthcare.
And after even within the first year, I started to have my own healthcare examples that I could use, and drawing on those from colleagues and other people. And I think the other thing that I was still struggling with in that first year in healthcare was finding the balance between getting stuff done and bringing others along. Like sometimes when you're an outside consultant or even as an internal change agent, there's pressure to get results. There's pressure to get stuff done versus teaching people and getting others engaged. And that's something that I think you just need to sometimes push back and say, hey, this is going to go a little bit slower, but people are going to learn more in the process. So with that, I want to introduce our special guest, or actually let him introduce himself, a good friend of mine and a friend of KaiNexus, Michael Lombard.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. It's Michael Lombard here. I'm the Corporate Director of Operational Excellence for Cornerstone Healthcare Group, and I've been working in healthcare for about the past 4.5 years. And like Mark, I've kind of had 2 first years where I was kind of the newcomer, making a lot of mistakes and learning from them. And so like Mark, I started in manufacturing, and I was actually in modular and manufactured housing. You can see from the picture there. We had assembly line, so a lot of the lean concepts from the automotive industry were very applicable, and I thought that it was just a natural fit. And one of my first mistakes that I made was, I went off for a seminar where they taught me some basic lean history and lean principles and all that good stuff. And then, it made so much sense to me. It just resonated so well with me. I was naive enough to think that if we just put all of our managers through the, educational program and expose them to these lean concepts, that they'll just automatically start applying these principles to their factory. And so I did that. I went back to the factory. I developed an awesome all-day training program full of simulations, and I did some good things well. Like the simulations were based on a factory environment, not or a modular home environment, not an automotive environment. And I used examples from our factory, so I tailored it to the audience. That was good, but the underlying philosophy was that by didactic education, we can cause a change in our culture. And that was very naive.
Yeah.
Very misguided.
People won't magically get it and be enthusiastic just from, I don't know if you will, book learning.
Yeah.
Right?
And, I was so disappointed because when we came out of the all-day training session, our managers, for the first time in years, they had really gotten excited about our improvement efforts, and they were really all on the same page. And they were, it was a great thing in the moment. But as soon as they went back to the factory, as soon as they went back to their day-to-day, nothing had really changed. And so that was my first little pearl, as Greg calls them, my first mistake that led to a great lesson learned. And it was that, didactic training does not lead to wholesale change in behaviors and change in your operating system. And that was something I had to modify as I went along. As I started to progress in my career, I started using education and training more strategically, I would say.
And I'm curious if you've experimented with different types of learning. There's lecture, there's discussion, there's hands-on simulations. Sometimes that's more effective.
Yeah, I've done it all pretty much. Yeah. At this point, what I've learned now is kind of what Greg was touching upon earlier, which is try to condense it down and keep it quick and to the point, and let them know kind of something specific that they can focus on to get started. And then let the learning by doing commence, basically.
Yeah.
And then to supplement it as you go with just-in-time learning. It's just the same principle. It's so funny how we as lean practitioners, and I'm making a blanket statement here. I know that people that are more advanced than me don't do this as much. But I can fall into the trap still to this day of, trying to bulk up my education, trying to do the batches of education too large. And so applying the principle of just in time to learning. So anyway, that was my big lesson learned from my first year in manufacturing. Then I had another first year, which was in healthcare. And this was about, like I said, about 4.5, 5 years ago. Through Mark's mentoring, I was able to go to work for a pediatric hospital in Dallas. And I did some good things. I learned from my previous lessons and my mistakes. And one of the things that we did well was when we went to do a big redesign of our ER patient flow processes, we did include all the right people. We didn't skip out on the middle managers. We didn't skip out on the senior leaders. We did not skip out on engaging the frontline clinical and non-clinical staff. So we had this awesome team that was really engaged, and they come up with some really great ideas for how to improve the care that we were delivering in the ER. And we implemented them, and we started to see great results. Okay, that's wonderful. I was in the role of black belt using the DMAIC approach to, deliver these results. And I kind of saw it as Mark saw his role as an engineer is to be the one to implement these improvements. I saw my role as the black belt to implement these improvements, and I was the owner of it. And of course, that works pretty well, during the project when you're very engaged with the folks in the ER and everybody's real excited. But as soon as I was reassigned to another project, we started to see that there was really no continuation of the improvement effort. We had not really started with the end in mind, with the end being we want to continue improvement on a daily basis, everybody involved, always moving towards our target condition. And so, and I realized that it was because when I started the project, we set goals for ourselves, but they were all related to improving processes, and none of our goals were related to building the capacity of our team. And, I think we sometimes get tunnel vision, just focus on producing results. And we don't leave enough room to coach people, to mentor, to, assign a lot of the improvement responsibility to the people that are doing the work, and trusting that they have the brains to pull it off, that they have the ability to learn quickly, because they do. But I think we forget that sometimes.
Yeah, and I think sometimes organizations focus on measuring process results as opposed to the end results. How many rapid improvement events did we do this year? Well, wait a minute. How are we affecting safety, quality, waiting times, and those measures that matter? Sometimes that's a reflection I've heard from a lot of people, is that we were too focused on what we were doing instead of what the results and the reasons why we're supposed to be, or assuming people understand those connections.
Exactly. And one last little pearl, one last little lesson learned that I'll share is, I always viewed things, when I was the black belt, when I was the project manager, I viewed things very mechanistically. I saw a process improvement as like, if I can tweak this and change that, it's like levers and pulleys that I can change the system and we'll get the results, and that I've done a good job. And I didn't understand the social component of it, the human component of it. We thought if you put a control plan in place with a dashboard of metrics, then things would naturally take care of themselves and continuous improvement would occur. And that's just not the case in a dynamic social setting such as a hospital.
Well, and I think even in a factory, I thankfully had good mentors. I'm just thinking back to my own first year. One of the things that made that first year bearable and even got me to a second year was having good mentors and coaches, both. And a lot of them were really informal coaches. My direct manager was good about this, but others were really good about coaching through different scenarios and just helping keep things in a positive direction. I think that's really important. A lot of people, unfortunately, don't have the benefit of that within their organization.
I found that one of the limiting factors in how quickly you can develop people is how quickly you can create a kind of a core group of coaches in your organization. And that's not something that's easy to do. You can do a little bit of training, and that might help. You can do some practice of coaching, that might help, but you need a framework, something like we're currently using the Toyota Kata approach to develop coaches and to kind of build habits. But there's a lot of different ways to do it, but you have to make it a goal of yours when you go into the improvement effort, and not try to do it on the back end after the project's over.
Yeah. So that's a great point. So Michael, thank you. And he's going to stay around for Q&A. Greg and Michael and I will all do Q&A. I invite you to go ahead and please enter more questions into the GoToWebinar chat box. And we'll just mention a few things while people are entering questions. We'd like to invite you to go and sign up for our next webinar. It's going to be on September 25th. You can go to KaiNexus.com/webinar. Later today or tomorrow, you should be able to sign up for that. We'll put a reminder in the follow-up email. I'm going to be joined by our CEO, Alan Wilson, who's going to be talking about things from an executive and a C-level perspective. What keeps executives up at night? And how can continuous improvement methodologies really, if not help you sleep better, help address those problems? So we invite you, and I hope you'll invite your senior leaders to that webinar, because Alan has a lot of experience working with senior leaders in different organizations and different industries.
Yeah, and I just will quickly mention, Mark, we came up with this topic and put together this body of knowledge. We talked to a lot of director of PI, director of quality folks, and one of the things that they were sharing to us is, how can we communicate to the C-level that process improvement and quality improvement really are connected intimately with any type of a strategic initiative or goal of the organization, because it's kind of like almost like a mechanism to get your organization around what the senior leadership is deeming as important. And so hopefully that will bring folks interested in that type of dialogue, and then even take the next step, bring their senior leaders to come listen to this. Alan has been a CEO for over 35 years in a number of different organizations, and he has continued to use process improvement and lean principles. He has been practicing, yes, if you will, lean. And so really being able to kind of speak that language.
Well, next time we see him, we'll remind him he's a practicing CEO.
There
right?
You go.
Yeah. We have a library of past webinars. Again, that next webinar, September blank, is September 25th. That's my defect in the slide. But we have a library of recorded webinars that we invite you to go and take a look at on different topics. And we have some other resources, including our blog at blog.kainexus.com. And we also have a number of free ebooks. If you go to kainexus.com/ebooks, we invite you to download those and read those and give us feedback. So with that, we're going to do Q&A. We'll probably follow up with a blog post if there's more questions than we can address. And I'd also like to invite you to share some of your reflections on your first year of continuous improvement. That you can reply to the email that we're going to send out with the link to the slides and the video. And if you reply to that email, we'd love to hear what you say, and we might ask you permission to include some of your thoughts into a blog post. So first question here is from Mohammed. Thank you for the question. It says, I am a Six Sigma Black Belt certified professional. However, it's not part of my job description to implement Six Sigma in that organization I work for. What is your recommendation for me to practice the knowledge I've learned in order to not lose it for lack of practicing? My thought on this, and I think this would apply whether it's Six Sigma or Lean or whatever methodology, is even if your organization doesn't have a formal program, hopefully the methods and the tools and the systems that you've learned can still be helpful in things that you're trying to accomplish individually. Can you use the statistical methods of Six Sigma? Can you use root cause analysis approaches from Lean to do your own job better? And hopefully that's beneficial to you in the organization, and hopefully it helps you demonstrate that Lean or Six Sigma, that methodology, can be helpful to more broadly.
Yeah, if that's the situation that you're in, you're kind of in startup mode. You might be a lone wolf, or you might just have a small coalition of people in your organization that are kind of practicing continuous improvement techniques, and that's okay. You can start small and start to get the snowball effect going if you are doing rapid cycles of experimentation and testing and proving out some of your ideas. I think that's a pretty effective approach to increase the size of your coalition and to build consensus for what it is that you do.
So we've got another question here from Matt that says, based on your experience in other industries, what are the top 2 unique challenges getting started with continuous improvement in healthcare? Greg, do you want to take a stab at that?
jump at that. I don't know if I have two, but the one that comes to mind, I think, is time. And so I think in a place that is constantly seeing patients, I'll just take a physician, for example. Asking a physician to take a week off from their clinic and from their practice is not very practical. It isn't going to happen. And so I've seen a lot of the transitions of how do you practice lean in that type of environment. And some of the really successful strategies I've seen is, instead of it being a week long, it could be a 1 or 2 hour session once a week for a period of 8 or 12 weeks, for instance. So trying to blend in and deal with people's schedules is one of the strategies I think that is unique to healthcare.
Well, and I think one of the other aspects of that we don't have time challenge is that people let that become an excuse instead of that being one of the first problems to solve. So if we're going to say that continuous improvement is important, and we're going to say that we're going to engage everybody, and we're going to put a statement saying as much on our website or in the lobby in the waiting room, then we need to work at it. We need to figure out, how do we make time for managers, for frontline staff? We can't just fall back on that or any other number of excuses.
Yeah,
Michael,
for sure. I mean, I've had meetings set up with clinicians, like a physician that came in and he's running 30 minutes late to a 60-minute meeting, and he has he just got done installing a pacemaker or doing some critical procedure. And in healthcare, you just have to be very flexible and realize that there's a lot of variation related to the human factor. Patients are not going to always respond the way that the physician expects them to respond. The clinicians aren't always going to respond the way that the PI facilitator expects them to respond. Everything is about people, and healthcare's every organization is a socio-technical organization, but healthcare is very heavy on the social side. So you have to be kind of flexible and more adaptive, I would say, not go in with some extensive plan for how things are going to go in your Kaizen event or your meeting, but have a more agile approach to it.
Yeah. There's another question from Deanna that says, how do you work around the attitude of we don't have time for continuous improvement? Okay, I should have read the whole question before. And get away from the focus on getting the freight out the door while still working on quality with quantity. Greg, have another thought?
Yeah, I was gonna take a stab at this. One of the ways that I found is really successful with getting physicians, clinicians, nurses, whoever to get engaged is to really make it personal. And so I used to coach people to say, stop and pause for a second when you're frustrated at work. Because if you're frustrated at work, oftentimes there's a process issue underlying that. And as soon as you make it really personable about their work, because people, especially in healthcare, but I think this applies to any organization, and as we're engaging in more and more organizations outside of healthcare, I'm seeing the same thing applies to any type of organization. But people want to do their work well.
And what I've seen work well is, and when leaders recognize that, and the leaders specifically do things to carve out time for people. I think of an organization I visited where the chief of the Transplant Institute was talking to the department that got patients into the process to even be considered for an organ transplant. Mm-hmm. Those people were busy all day long. There was a backlog of people waiting to get into the backlog. And this world-renowned surgeon told the team, look, we have a lot of work to do, and this is serious work that people need, and it helps people. But at some point, we choose to go home to our families at the end of the day. We have to go home and eat dinner. We make choices. We can also make the choice to spend 20 minutes a day working on process improvement, because that 20 minutes a day is how we're going to help fix problems and free up time so that we can take care of more people all those other days into the future. And I really admired him taking that stand and saying, there will be no repercussions for people making that choice to make an investment today and making things better in the future, as opposed to being just caught in that hamster wheel of constantly being too busy.
And that's a change management aspect right there, Mark. I think that's a great point, that And I think that it works because it's coming from the very senior, the very top, saying, this is a strategic goal. And so I think between that and saying, hey, let's focus on issues that make your day inefficient, can really get people to be engaged and saying, hey, I'm going to stop fighting fires for 30 minutes a day or 20 minutes or even, 15 minutes a day. So there's fewer fires in the future.
Yeah. So with that, we've got 3 other really good questions here that I don't think we're going to be able to give justice to. So we will answer those individually and maybe make blog posts out of these other questions so we can wrap up here for the top of the hour. But again, I want to thank you on behalf of the whole team at KaiNexus, on behalf of Greg and Michael. Thank you for taking time out to view the webinar today. We hope you'll connect with us through our website, on social media. Boy, I've got another defect in the slide I need to fix, our LinkedIn.com. If you search LinkedIn for KaiNexus, you can find us there, and you can see our contact information. If you've got questions about the webinar, if you have questions about what we do at KaiNexus to help make improvement happen through our web-based software platform, we would love to talk to you about that. But thank you again for being part of our webinar today, and thank you, Michael. Thank you, Greg.
My pleasure. Thank you.